Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we put a bow on the offseason as the Timberwolves made some final moves over the weekend as training camp came to a close. Who can we expect to see in Iowa that was on the training camp roster? Plus, a look at Zach Lowe's NBA League Pass rankings over at ESPN. How watchable are the Wolves to a casual NBA fan, to the national, the fan of basketball as a whole? How watchable are the Wolves? We'll talk about all that here today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend, and it is almost here. We're just a day away from the start of the Timberwolves regular season. There's plenty to talk about this week. First of all, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. If you're watching on YouTube, yes, it's a new background. No, I won't always have an empty shelf. Just moved a couple days ago and almost in time for the first game. I guess we're 2 days away. Today's Monday. 2 days away for the first game. Hopefully by the first game, we'll have a little bit more exciting of a backdrop if you're watching on YouTube. But you can also listen to the show on any of your favorite audio platforms. You can follow on Twitter at LockedOnTWolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A reminder, there's also a brand new Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can listen to Locked On Wolves. You can watch Locked On Wolves, as well as any of our other Locked On Minnesota sports podcasts. They're all fantastic. It's more great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's absolutely free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. Okay, this is a packed week. I want to kind of put a bow on the offseason and training camp. There were some roster moves over the weekend, relatively minor ones, but concerning players that we saw play in the preseason. So I wanted to cover all that. I want to talk about Zach Lowe's league pass rankings over at ESPN. The Wolves are much higher than they've been in a very, very long time. Surely the Jimmy Butler season would have been the last time the Wolves were in the top 10. So we'll talk about that today in the show. For the rest of the week, though, season preview stuff the next couple of days. I want to spend much of Tuesday. Really, that'll be the season preview show. Over unders, my Timberwolves win total projection. So don't miss Tuesday's show. I was within a couple wins last year. I was much more optimistic than most of the projection rankings, projection systems, preseason rankings, and sure enough, the Wolves were better than expected. I'll give my final win total projection on Tuesday, my Western Conference order, a couple over unders. And then on Wednesday, we'll, of course, preview Wolves Thunder, the home opener and season opener on Wednesday night. So without further ado, let's get into today's show. Some moves here from the weekend. The Timberwolves, it was reported actually following the game on Friday night, I guess it was, that the Wolves were going to keep Luka Garza on a 2-way contract. And we had heard following his big game last Wednesday when Chris Finch talked glowingly about Garza, talked glowingly about the front office adding Garza. He said it was a great find by our front office. And of course, Garza was on a training camp deal, an Exhibit 10 deal, where he was expected to go to Iowa after the preseason and play there in the G League and not ever make the NBA roster. But he performed so well in his preseason action. He had that double-double in like a quarter, in like just the fourth quarter about a week ago. The Wolves added him on a 2-way, and they decided to let A.J. Lawson go. We talked a lot about A.J. Lawson back when he was signed back in July, kind of a bouncy forward, kind of in some ways similar to Jaden McDaniels, somebody with a lot of upside defensively, with a little bit, more offensive game than you might expect for somebody so young with such limited professional experience. But instead, Lawson didn't really see much in the way of preseason action. Instead, they choose to let him go and give his 2-way slot to Luka Garza, who, of course, was a rookie last year, a second-round pick of the Pistons, has some NBA experience because of that, of course, some G League experience as well, but adding some depth to that front court by keeping Luka Garza. So significant. Also, the Timberwolves waived PJ Dozier, of course, a former Denver Nuggets forward who had torn his ACL last year, very familiar with Tim Connolly. They also waived CJ Ellaby, who is a 2-way player for the Portland Trailblazers last season, ended up playing in 50-plus games for Portland because of all their injuries and issues. He didn't see much preseason action. Dozier didn't play at all in the preseason. I'm sure still working his way back entirely from the ACL. Those guys were all waived, and expectations would be that if they're not claimed, there's a real possibility they end up back in Iowa. So that shouldn't be a huge surprise. But those guys were all waived. And then finally, the Wolves signed and waived 3 players. 2 have been in the organization previously. The third is a name that casual NBA fans will likely be familiar with, Emmanuel Mudiay, a former lottery pick of the Denver Nuggets. And of course, Tim Connolly was there when they drafted Mudiay. He was a very disappointing lottery selection. He played more extensively with Utah, actually, somewhat coincidentally, with Rudy Gobert. After he'd been traded there, he was with the Knicks a couple of years ago. I think he played in like 2 games for Sacramento last year in a 10-day deal. But Mudiay has been in and out of the league for the last few years. It was way back in, what was it, 2015. He was a lottery pick of the Nuggets. Only played there 2.5 years before he was traded to the Knicks. And then it was the Knicks first and then Utah. So I beg your pardon from what I said a moment ago. The Knicks first and then Utah, and then a couple games of Sacramento last year. His best season probably did come with the Knicks in 2018-19, but he's still only 26 years old. He's just had a really, like, he was never a good enough shooter really to stick in the league. None of the shooting percentages are good. Turnovers were an issue, and consistency on defense was also an issue. So there were a lot of problems, but he's got good size for a point guard, and obviously still a little bit upside at the age of 26. But the Wolves signed him and waived him, which basically just means that they now have the ability to add him to the G League team in Iowa. The other 2 players that the Wolves signed and waived are names that may sound familiar if you followed the offseason closely, and that's guard Matt Lewis and Philip Wheeler, a forward who initially was rumored to, I think the first reports way back in July were that he might get a 2-way deal. Wheeler's a little bit more interesting. He didn't graduate high school. There were some academic issues, so he wasn't able to attend college here in the U.S. He went and played in Puerto Rico, and then last year played in 8 games in the G League. So he's only 20 years old, but he was, a top high school type recruit. Like back when he played in high school, he was seen as like a really high upside guy, super bouncy, long, athletic, obviously extremely raw and inexperienced. But he'll be with the G League team in Iowa. I think he's really intriguing. And then Matt Lewis played for Iowa last season. So if you followed the G League team at all, he was part of that team, and then also played in summer league for the Wolves each of the last 2 seasons, I believe. Lewis last year in the G League averaged 11 points, 4 rebounds, and 2.5 assists in 32 games for the Iowa Wolves. And again, was with the summer league team again this summer. So a couple familiar faces going to the Iowa Wolves, plus Emmanuel Mudiay, which will be an interesting one to keep an eye on. Remember, we talked about this roster construction a little bit this offseason. The Wolves don't have a 3rd string point guard. Most teams will use a 2-way deal. The Wolves have done that quite a bit in the past. Last year with McKinley Wright, a couple seasons ago, actually consecutive years with Jordan McLaughlin was a 2-way player. Going back even further, the Wolves have had combo guards on 2-way deals, even back under Tom Thibodeau, Ryan Saunders. The idea being like that's your emergency guy. If somebody goes out with an illness or an injury and you need to call somebody up for a couple of games, you have someone that can run the ship or I guess steer the ship, run the show, whatever analogy you want to use. The Wolves don't have that guy. They only have D'Angelo Russell and Jordan McLaughlin. They obviously have a lot of trust in those guys, and they've got a bunch of options. We talked about this pretty extensively on the show, but between Jalen Noel, Austin Rivers, Austin Rivers has played quite a bit of point guard in his career. He's probably kind of the de facto 3rd point guard. You've got Noel, you've got Bryn Forbes, and obviously Ant's going to initiate a lot of offense too, but they don't really have like another true point guard. If either Russell or McLaughlin missed extended time, you need to add somebody. So the idea here, I'm sure, is you bring in Mudiay, somebody that Connolly's familiar with, someone that Gobert and Dell Demps is on the coaching staff now, was in Utah when, or Demps was on the coaching staff in Utah when Mudiay was there. So you've got guys that have familiarity with Mudiay. Mudiay is familiar with some of the stuff that the Wolves are going to want to do. He's probably more of an emergency type guy, like midway through the season. If somebody were to get injured, he could be your backup point guard. It's probably not ideal for a team that wants to be, certainly not ideal for a team that wants to be a top 4 seed in the West, but it's somebody with experience, with some familiarity that can run an offense, and he's in the G League now with the Wolves and can be called upon in an emergency type situation. All right. That's kind of the bow on the offseason. What I want to do next is I want to look at the league pass rankings and then kind of just peek ahead at the next couple of weeks and what this run's going to look like for the Wolves. The schedule is pretty forgiving early in the season, so I want to cover each of those things here for the rest of today's show. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at Rocket Money. So I mentioned this off the top of the show. If where I'm looking, if you're watching on YouTube or where I'm sitting looks extremely empty, it's because it is. I just moved to a new house this week. And on top of all the other things when you're moving, there's subscriptions you got to move, you got to cancel, you got to change. And there certainly were some cancellations. And it's not easy to do. If you're trying to cancel cable, um, any sort of streaming service, any sort of like, if you're changing your internet service, you need to cancel one and get another one, which is actually literally what I had to do. It's hard to do. Sometimes they make you jump through several hoops. It could take even hours waiting on hold. You can't simply do it online in a lot of cases. So it's just not an easy process. And it's something that absolutely can contribute to wasting money and absolutely wasting time. And of course, we all know time is money. The app Rocket Money will show all of your subscriptions in one place, and it cancels what you don't want for you. Rocket Money can even find subscriptions that you didn't even know that you were paying for. You may even find out you've been double charged for a subscription, which is obviously the worst. To cancel a subscription, all you have to do is press cancel, and Rocket Money takes care of the rest. Cancel unnecessary subscriptions with Rocket Money today. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Seriously, it could save you hundreds per year. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen today. Now make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. Follow Game to Game. That's the number 2, Game to Game on Locked On NBA. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay. NBA League Pass rankings is something Zach Lowe's done for years and years and years and years, going all the way back to his days at Grantland. Well, actually, he says here, the 11th. It actually feels like it's been longer than 11 years, but where he ranks every team in the league with their watchability. He's got 5 categories that he scores them all 1 to 10, and I'll quickly run through them. I think this is a ton of fun to who's the worst team to watch, who's the best team to watch, and where do the Wolves fall, and do we agree with that? The categories are zeitgeist. So his explanation for that is when you talk about this team at parties, do people slink away? Like, do casual fans want to talk about this team? Highlight potential, kind of self-explanatory. If you tune into a random, Jazz game, are you going to see a highlight? Probably not, unless you're a big Vanderbilt fan, which I am. So who knows? I guess to each his own. Style. Where are they on the continuum from Golden State Warriors' beautiful game to Julius Randle just took 4 jab steps and launched an 18-footer? League Pass minutia, which this is like if you're flipping through League Pass, you know exactly what this is. Are the announcers any good? I could list right now 5 announcing teams that I think are awful. Court designs, uniforms, etc. And then unintentional comedy. The example he gives is the Washington Wizards of the early 2010s. Roughly I guess 10 years ago now. So he ranks them each 1 to 10. Then he has them 30 to 1. I'm not going to go through every single team, but I will note a couple of notables. The Utah Jazz are ranked 30th. And then he says, this is rough. The Jazz aren't really a basketball team, is what he says, after detonating the Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Quinn Snyder, making amazing faces era. And he points out the list of shoot first combo guards: Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, Taylor Horton Tucker, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. There's tons of them. Of course, there's aging Mike Conley. They have some questionable new uniforms. Some of the courts are okay. And then he finishes it by saying Jared Vanderbilt is cool. That's his last note, which is true. Jared Vanderbilt's a ton of reason, really the only reason to watch the Jazz. The Pacers, the Spurs, the Wizards, these are all teams towards the bottom of his list. A couple notables, the Heat are all the way down at 20. And he basically, he blames it a lot on them getting rid of the Miami Vice jerseys, and that they're just kind of tough to watch, which is true at times. I mean, unless Jimmy's cooking late in a game, that can be tough to watch. But for a really good team, that's probably a top 12 team in the NBA, to see them ranked 20th in watchability rankings is pretty interesting. The Pistons are an interesting one because I think they'll be improved this year, but they're not going to be good. He's got them at 16. They're bringing back some of the teal, which is I don't know, interesting. I think it's cool. Like, I don't know. There's this weird late 90s, early 2000s where the Pistons kind of did a little too much blue, not enough teal, and they couldn't quite get the balance right, but they're bringing back some of it this year, which will be fun. So that's where the Pistons are. And then you get into some of the good teams. The Suns are at 14, the Hawks 13, the Cavs at 12, which I thought maybe they'd be a little bit higher. You've obviously got Rubio and Kevin Love, which is interesting. JB Bickerstaff, lots of Timberwolves ties there. The Sixers at 11, and then he gets into the top 10. And your Minnesota Timberwolves are all the way up at number 8 in the Zach Lowe NBA League Pass rankings this year, ahead of Dallas, ahead of the Lakers. The main reason is Anthony Edwards, and then also Chris Finch. He talks about how Chris Finch is what he calls him one of the league's keenest offensive tinkerers, trying to figure out how to mesh Towns and Gobert. Talks a lot about Kyle Anderson as well, being fun to watch. Lowe really likes, if you listen at all to Zach Lowe, his podcast, The Lowe Post, he loves Kyle Anderson. There's also the new, what are they? The new statement jerseys, the black with the neon. If you haven't seen those, I hadn't even noticed this at first glance, which is embarrassing because I'm in marketing for a living, but the M and the V in Timberwolves on the jersey look like fangs coming down on either side of the numbers. So that's really cool. Talks about those. And then he also mentions that Towns has to play better in the playoffs, which is not relevant to this article, but 100% true. So he's got the Wolves at 8, mostly because of Ant, updated jerseys, Chris Finch, and then also like what's going to happen with Towns and Gobert. And I think that that's a really fair ranking. I'm totally fine with it. The teams he's got ahead of them, I can't really quibble with this. He's got the Bucks at 7. Obviously, Giannis has to be high. And their court and their jerseys are awesome. He's got the Celtics at 6. That would be maybe the one that I'd quibble with. I'd maybe bump the Wolves up a spot and slot the Celtics down at 8 or 9. Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, they're fun, and the court is obviously iconic. The jerseys are great, but I don't know. Again, teach his own, I guess. I don't know that I have the Celtics up at 6. The Pelicans at 5, which to me is a real boomer bust. Like, I like watching CJ McCollum. I like watching Larry Nance Jr., which is weird, but I think he's fun to watch with all of his screens and cuts and everything that he does off the ball, and then the occasional massive dunk. Zion Williamson is, of course, the linchpin here. If Zion plays and is healthy and plays well, they're going to be a ton of fun to watch. But if he's not, I don't like their court. I don't like their jerseys. I do like their announcing crew, but having them at 5 is boom or bust. The Nuggets at 4 makes sense. Memphis at 3, sure. Well, I think that there are things about the Grizzlies that are overrated. I've talked about that quite a bit. They are fun to watch, and I do like most everything about them. The Warriors at 2, and then the Nets at 1, which is really high. I love the Nets announcing crew. Of course, the Wolves now have Michael Grady as their play-by-play guy. He'd been part of that team in Brooklyn, but I love their announcing crew. I love their jerseys. I love their court. But that's a big boomer bust too, because who knows what's going to happen with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Steve Nash. What happens here? If everything turns out well, they're going to be a ton of fun to watch, and of course we'll be tuning into them on League Pass. But if it blows up, I guess maybe there's unintentional comedy there too, and he mentions that. But putting the Nets at 1, I think, is a gamble. All that to say, the Wolves at 8 make a lot of sense to me. I'm totally fine with it. The highest I would probably have them would be 7. I don't know that I'd go much higher. If you're looking at the overall, again, not from a Timberwolves, somebody who covers the Wolves, or from a Wolves fan perspective, but from a global NBA perspective, if you're naming your top 10 teams to watch, the Wolves are obviously in those top 10 this season. They have to be. So anyway, go check that out on ESPN. It's a great read, as always. It's a 2-part, 11 through 30 is part 1, and then 1 through 10 just posted as part 2 the other day. So go check that out. All right, let's close by taking a peek ahead at the upcoming schedule for the Wolves, where I think they'll be through the first, we'll call it 10 to 12 games, which I guess is a bit of a preview at Tuesday's show when I go all in on my final predictions for the Western Conference for the Timberwolves win-loss record this season. So we're going to hit the schedule here next. Let's talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. A big football weekend. Of course, the Vikings, fantastic start to the year. Their rivals, the Green Bay Packers, a very rough start to the season. Vikings are sitting pretty good. If you bet football at all, and we could talk about college, but man, the Gophers are in a rough spot too. You bet football at all, the place to be, or if you bet any sport for that matter, is BetOnline. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game possible. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, of course, playoff MLB action now. NHL is about to start up, plus MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, the Timberwolves open the season with what looks like a ridiculously easy stretch of games. And I like we're basing this off of, I mean, there's plenty of variables here, right? We're basing this off of last season. We're basing this off of this season's projections based on rosters and teams that we believe are on Wembanyama watch. Or we'll just say it on this show. This isn't a directly NBA affiliated podcast. Teams that are tanking for Wembanyama, right? Or tanking in general for one of the top 2 picks next year, for that matter. There's, I mean, like, the Wolves are going to be favored in their first, we'll call it 7 games, almost certainly. Unless something goes drastically wrong in the first few, and then maybe a couple of those might flip. But like, I mean, they're going to get off to a great start. And I mentioned this, I was actually on the Locked On NBA show today, on Monday's show, with Jackson Gatlin, who's also the host of Locked On Rockets. And I told him, I think I said it maybe off recording after we finished. I was like, hey, I might be on the show the next couple of weeks if the Wolves are, like, call it 8-0 or 7-1 or something, because, like, for people that maybe aren't looking at the Wolves schedule, they're to look up and go, whoa, the Wolves are 7-1. I mean, they're playing a ridiculously easy schedule. And don't be surprised if the Wolves trim some minutes back for their best players or rest some guys. They only have one back-to-back in the stretch. And so perhaps there's a chance for some rest there, and it's a road home back-to-back. So we'll run through this real quick, and I'll tell you where I think they'll be after, let's call it 12 games. The Wolves start at home for Oklahoma City and Utah, Wednesday, Friday. So they get an off day in between. They'll be heavily favored. I believe they're already maybe 10.5 or 11-point favorites, according to Bet Online, versus Oklahoma City on Wednesday. OKC, I think, will end up being the worst team in the West. It's either going to be them or Houston. And with no Chet Holmgren, it's basically running it back from last year for Oklahoma City. I wouldn't be shocked if they're the worst team in the West. So they have Oklahoma City at home Wednesday, Utah at home on Friday. I think Utah is certainly better than, even though I just last segment read what Zach Lowe said about them not even being a basketball team. I do think they have got more good players, like, right now, not a young core, but more good, like, actual players with NBA experience right now that they're going to back into some wins because they've got good players. So that's Utah on Friday. I think they're better than Oklahoma City and Houston, but still bad, of course. That's 2 wins. I just don't see any way. Like, I mean, obviously it's possible anything can happen and you're going to lose a couple of these throughout the season, but on, to start the season with solid rest, if they play, I said this after the loss to Brooklyn Friday in preseason, the Wolves play like they did to Brooklyn last Friday, or did against Brooklyn last Friday against the Thunder, they're going to win. Probably the same against the Jazz. They didn't play great, but they played well enough to beat a bad team. And that's going to be enough on several nights in this NBA season. It's one of the reasons why we'll get into this on Tuesday. Some of these projections for the Wolves, I think, are way too low. There's a ton of these teams that are not actively trying to win. They don't have rosters that are trying to win. The Wolves have like 9 rotation guys, 10, 11 rotation guys that are better than the majority of all of these rosters of tanking teams. I just like, or better than, they would all be better than everyone on the roster except for like one guy, right? So like on the Thunder, you take out Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, those have like 9 guys that are better than their next best guy. And that's not an exaggeration. That's definitely true. So you get the Thunder Wednesday, the Jazz Friday, another day off. They have Oklahoma City on the road Sunday, but that's the only road game in their first 6. They play 5 of their first 6 at home. Oklahoma City on Sunday. They travel back home for the back-to-back Monday night against San Antonio. Then they get the Spurs again Wednesday. So if you're going to pick a loss in your first 5, it's probably against the Spurs, traveling on a back-to-back the first night against a team you play twice. The Spurs could back into a win there. I'll go ahead and give it a loss just because I think it's tough to win 5 games in a row to start a season. I think they'll beat the Spurs next Wednesday. I mean, that's what, 4-1 at that point. Then you get the Lakers at home next Friday. They should be favored in that game unless something goes terribly wrong in the first 5. And I think they'll beat the Lakers next Friday. That's another very winnable game. It's a team they should beat. That would make them 5-1 at that point. And then you go to San Antonio on Sunday. That's an NBA TV game. So another day off in between. And then it gets really tough. So say they go, what is that? I'm losing track. 6-1 through their first 7, with 3 against the Spurs, 2 against the Thunder, 1 against the Jazz, 1 against the Lakers, and 5 of their first 7 at home. I'll say they're 6-1 going to Phoenix for Tuesday, November 1st. That's the TNT late game. It's a 9 p.m. Central tip at Phoenix. I don't know what Phoenix's schedule looks like, but I would imagine they're going to have a good record, right? So you could have like the 6-1 Wolves against the, I don't know, like 6-1 or 5-2 or whatever Suns. That's going to be a huge game. That's going to be the talk of the NBA that night. The Wolves play Phoenix that Tuesday. They'll probably lose. That'll make them 6-2. Then they have 2 days off before coming home to play the Bucks on an ESPN game on Friday night. We'll call that a loss too, for the sake of argument here. It makes them 6-3, but then you get Houston and the Knicks at home. Say they win both of those. That makes them 8-3 in their first 12. that's only 11. So we'll go one more. They get Phoenix at home the next game. That could go either way. That's going to be, they have normal rest at home. We'll say it's a loss. That's 8-4 in their first 12, but it could easily be a 9-3 in their first 12. And I think that that's probably the most likely scenario. If you look at each one of these games individually and say, do they win or do they lose? You're probably looking at 9-3 or 8-4. There's absolutely a chance they could be 10-2. They could be a game or two worse than 8-4. I don't think that's likely. And it would be actually pretty awful if they're anything worse than 8-4, given this schedule in the first 12. But I think they're pretty likely to be 9-3, maybe even 10-2. That's kind of the range. And then things get a bit tougher. You get Memphis, Cleveland, Orlando, then Philadelphia, then Miami. So you've got 4 out of 5 with Memphis, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Miami, and 3 of those 4 are on the road. So we're going to learn a lot about this team leading into Thanksgiving, and then things lighten up just a little bit more after that. But the first 2 weeks are extremely winnable games for the Wolves. Don't be surprised if in 2 weeks you look up and the Minnesota Timberwolves are sitting there at 9-3 or 8-4 and, second, third, fourth in the Western Conference. We're going to extrapolate that out a bit further. Obviously, the schedules all even out to some extent over the course of the season. So again, Tuesday's show, don't miss it. Tuesday's show will be a projection fest. I'm going to project the Western Conference. I'm going to project the Timberwolves individual win total, and then a couple of other kind of bold predictions for the Wolves. And we'll also do some more predictions on Wednesday along with that Thunder preview. So all that's upcoming here this week. Make sure you're following and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, you can watch on YouTube, and you can also listen on any of your favorite audio platforms. This show is free and available everywhere. You can also follow on Twitter at LockedOnTWolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. And also a reminder, you can find this show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can find on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. All the Locked On Sports Minnesota shows can be found there. Again, Roku or Amazon Fire TV, 24/7 on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, and it's absolutely free. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. You can make your second listen the Locked On NBA show. The NBA season is here. Our local NBA experts and insiders have you covered on and off the court all season long. All the biggest stories around the NBA every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. It's available on YouTube, Odyssey, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.